as the first resort to resolving this, we didn't even fix this, right? Because we didn't even know where the issue was, right? I've had this specific word which people used to say that data ud raha hai. Data ud raha hai, right?
Like, why was it done in the first place, which caused the problem?
At least like 3 months, we haven't had such major issues. And within a week, we felt that it was all just like multiple people just like not just one customer, multiple customers coming out and saying that, you know what, this is an issue. Right?
How did that actual debugging go? If at all you recall, because I don't see how you would discover that.
The reproducibility was so hard, right? Like there is no way that, you know, you can consistently reproduce it. It was like a week plus, like, and like, it was like a nightmare in the sense that I had like at least like 3-4 people in the team completely lost sleep.
From such a panic, how do you come out and still retain your strategic lens so that you're able to come up with more creative ideas about how to explain it technically, and then actually have the guts left to try it on the ground?
Most of the time, if the junior engineer is failing, it's not that the junior engineer is failing, it's the process that failed, right? We didn't do the proper code review, we didn't do the proper due diligence before it got shipped. So
the fact that this has happened, as a senior engineer, you have to first digest it yourself so that you are grounded and you are stable. You can explain what happened firsthand, and you also get to see what happens on the other side of the table. From the business point of view, how are people looking at this situation?
I would actually say that if you're experiencing this early in your career, it's actually a gift.
Welcome to the podcast Engineering Unplugged with me, Bhavin. Thank you to 10x Eng for very graciously sponsoring today's episode. Today we have Alagu Muthuraman, the co-founder at Peoplebox. He handles tech, product and customer success there. I and Alagu chat about a very interesting and intense production issue that was hard to reproduce and the stress management during and around such incidents. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Please subscribe for more such content. And we are live. Welcome, Alagu, to Engineering Unplugged podcast. This is episode number 3. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure you have great stories on the way while you were building Peoplebox. What would you like to share with the audience today?
Hey, Bhavin, absolutely. Thanks for having me here. And sure, like I can share a lot of stories, and maybe to start with the most recent one where it's actually as recent as probably like a month old or something. So one of the things our product does is to allow people to write business review meetings and present it to their leaders. Usually people write it overnight on a weekend and present it to their managers. And what started happening is that they were writing, and the next day morning they're going to go and present, and the data is gone, right? There's absolutely no data, and the data has just disappeared, right? And so I had this exact same situation probably twice back in my career. So I have had those nightmares. And then the primary reason why so the first time when we had this issue was in my previous job, where it was like a mobile application, where it was online offline sync, the typical, when you have to have the state consistency issue, right? And the second time which we had was in Peoplebox itself, in one of the other places where we had a collaborative editing, right? Like you have to have like a state maintenance. This time again was the same thing, right? And this time we used a different library. It was a brand new, React library, which also had like a Node.js backend. And what happened is that like we hardly had this issue earlier, but what we found out that like our product didn't have so many users using collaborative editing at the same point, right? That was not happening. What happened is that I think suddenly there was a peak. There are multiple people writing the same document, and to give more context, this is more like the expectation of this is more like a Google Doc, right? Two people write, three people write, multiple people write at the same time. What used to happen is that one person was writing, and then so one person would have their laptop just open in that empty page, and they would close their laptop, and they would go on to do some other work, and the other person would open the same document, would write a lot in that page, and when the person who just went away with the empty page, they open it up again, it would completely erase the one that the second person wrote, right? So that was like major thing, and we had like crazy, like that 1 week was a complete sleepless time, and it was also a completely new library. We didn't have a lot of support. Like there were support, but there weren't a lot of things which actually said that this issue was there, right? Would you want me to go into the details, the technicals of it, why it went like that? Would that be?
Yeah, like for sure, because the audience is technical. So understanding the issue would also help create the context.
So, like you have a front end which is like a React front end, and this front end actually uses a library called Hocus Pocus, and this Hocus Pocus is like all this recent collaborative editing uses technology called CRDT, right? Which actually gets to the state of consistency when multiple people are collaborating over it, right? What we had is that the front end is supposed to talk to a Node.js real-time server, right? And show the data there when people are typing, right? What we used to do is that when people actually load the page, we go and hit the API, web API, not the Node.js API. We used to hit the web API, pull the latest version of the document, show it there, and then continue using the Node.js for the rest of the. So the initial transaction used to happen from the API, and then after that, everything was through the Node.js API. And when someone comes back online again, we didn't do any sort of, get the most recent data. We never did that again, right? So, and that had to happen through the Node.js server, right? Because so the fundamental thing that we actually, and this is probably like the most obvious thing to do, but we sort of missed it, was that you should not have two sources of truth to read and write, right? Like you're reading from the web API and you're writing to the Node.js.
Yeah.
And that was probably the most obvious one, which we didn't realize. And later on, we completely shut off the API-based transactions and moved it to the Node.js. That was one issue. The other one also was that we didn't even handle the like we did handle the online offline going and coming back in a very high level way. We would say that it's disconnected, connected, but what we didn't know that there were multiple layers of the connection establishment, right? First is that the user was actually online, offline. That's probably the most obvious one. The second one is that the user is online, but they are not able to connect to our backend API, right? And if they're able to connect to our backend API, are they authenticated, right? So there are multiple layers of them actually getting connected. And when they get disconnected, then reconnecting back again, right? This sort of flows had like multiple layers of getting to the final thing that are you really connected to the server or not, right? So that's something which I like. We had this issue earlier, but like we had encountered this earlier, but when it came again, and like now we have completely resolved it in the way that like we have handled all the specific points, and we so as the first resort to resolving this, we didn't even fix this, right? Because we didn't even know where the issue was, right? So the first resort that we did was to actually build a versions table, right? In the sense that the same document, when people are overwriting each other, every time when there is a write, take a snapshot and have it in the version history. So at least when people are trying to say that, hey, my complete document is gone, at least you have the version history. So yeah,
Yeah.
that was one of the most recent ones.
So, okay, let's double click on some of the items here. The library was responsible for keeping the same version of the document consistent across two browsers or multiple browsers. Is that correct?
The library, not out of the box, you have to handle those callbacks. If you do those callbacks, then it would, right? But it had those callbacks. So the thing is that the library doesn't take care of storage by itself. Storage is your problem.
Right.
Your in database, or you are hitting directly through your internal API. That's all your problem, right? So basically, they give those hooks. So you
Understood. So on the UI, the library would detect that some new content has come up on browser one, and it's going to, through the hook, it's going to call some API that you would have told it to call. Correct. And then you have to handle the storage in the backend. And how would that change get propagated to the other browsers from the backend?
So what happens is that, think about this more like it's more like a pub-sub system, in the sense that when somebody is online, everyone is a subscriber. It's just like a standard chat, like say all this chat interfaces, right? Like all these chat interfaces, there are pub-sub mechanisms.
Yeah.
Difference here is that, think about it like each and every, let's say I'm pressing a keystroke, right? I'm pressing ABCD. Each and every keystroke is a transaction. Even if I delete a letter, it's a transaction, right? So all these transactions are just queued, right? And it has to go through a standard queue. And like the equivalent is more similar to a Git commit repository, right? Like if you look at a Git commit repository, you have multiple people committing, and they can be committing in local, but eventually they push to the main server, right? Like where they actually push it to the origin. Very similar to that, like you could have multiple versions of it. Eventually, you need to have the same log, right? Like it has to be a chained one after the other. We broke this chain because we implemented it in a way when we were actually fetching the state, we were fetching from the web API. But when we were trying to do the sync, we were using the Node.js, backend, right? And more, in terms of customer impact, this was like massive, right? Like think about people writing day in and day out, and like massive trust issue, saying that, we should completely stop using the product, right? Like it's as good as the product being, the website being down, right? Even if you have the interface and everything working, the people will not trust, because they are spending time writing, and it's I think I've had this specific word which people used to say, that data ud raha hai. Data ud raha hai, right? So I've had this nightmarish thing which we had when we did that mobile app as well. I think it's mostly because when such real-time systems or such syncing needs to be done, and like the thing that it was also built by a fairly junior engineer. So in the sense that we had to make sure like that, all those cases are handled, is not something that we did as well, right? So those were also some things that we had to take away.
Interesting. Yeah, for the non-Hindi speakers, data ud raha hai means data is evaporating. And literally the data would evaporate because they wrote it and it got saved, and then somebody else overwrote it, thereby evaporating the old version. So okay, so the library would handle the deltas, and the storage was your problem.
Exactly.
Why did you have to load it the first time from the web API? And could you have done it through this Node.js API itself? Like, why was it done in the first place, which caused the problem?
So it's a good point. So in the sense that we didn't build the collaborative part as the first version of the product. When we built the first version, it was just like a static editor where the read and write was happening only through the web, right? It was just like a normal editor where every time when you press a keystroke, it would debounce and it would do a web API again, right? So the difference that they did is that, okay, read is okay with the API, right? Let's go to the Node.js. Was the issue like read also should be from the Node.js API, right? So
okay. So this was an old design decision, basically, which worked well in that situation because you were not doing collaborative editing. And later, when the system evolved, that design decision came back to bite you. And it was not apparent to anyone that this has to be reviewed or redone because it's working. So you like standard rule of thumb, right? If it's not broken, you don't touch it. So you didn't touch it. And that broke a lot.
And the interesting thing also is that it's not that we saw this immediately after it becoming live, right?
Because not a lot of people were using the collaborative version.
Like it was working fine for almost like 4 or 5 months. Like we hadn't had anyone, actually I wouldn't say 4 or 5 months, I would say at least like 3 months we haven't had such major issues. And within a week we felt that it was all just like multiple people just like not just one customer, multiple customers coming out and saying that, this is an issue, right? So like we thought that this was like so when the first customer reported, the first reaction is that, it might be like your internet issue, right? That's the first knee-jerk reaction that most of the like, did you go offline? Were you on a 3G network? Those are a couple of initial things, but the reality is that even if you're on a 3G network, it should still be reliable, right? That's what, like, I think the gold standard that probably I see is WhatsApp, right? Um, like the reason WhatsApp is so reliable is because despite whatever network, the reliability that has a message been sent to the server, has a message been sent to the other person, has the person read it, right? And it's absolutely true, right? There is no confusion around it, which is probably why it's so reliable, right?
Yeah, there is no loss. Like once you send a message, the contract is very clear and you are guaranteed that the message will reach the other end.
Yeah.
Even if their phone is switched off, after a few days when they will switch it on, the message will appear there.
Yeah.
Right. So going back to your example, right, just being curious here to dig down further. It was a design issue and it didn't occur to people that the old design has to be re-reviewed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you couldn't even pinpoint the issue when it was happening. You didn't immediately understand where exactly the gap is, and you built the versioning table. How did you actually narrow it down to that API, which was reading it from the web API while loading the element? How did that actual debugging go? If at all you recall, because I don't see how you would discover that.
Sure. So actually, yeah. So I think one of the biggest challenges at that point was that the reproduce, like I think usually when people say that, you know what, are you able to reproduce? If you're able to reproduce, we can fix it, right? The reproducibility was so hard, right? Like there is no way that, you know, you can consistently reproduce it. And what was also happening is that even so we dogfood the product internally as well, right? Internally, when we were doing our own business reviews, it was happening. But when we sat together to reproduce it, it was not. So we tried to look at the exact same scenarios and everything. But in essential, right? Like I think what really helped is to say, hey, you know what? Let's forget everything. Let's read through the entire code again. Let's look at how the data is passing through each and every step and how the data is getting saved to the database, right? And every time when a person presses from multiple, let's say multiple browsers, they are actually typing in, how is it consistently getting saved in the database? Can we just understand it from first principles in the sense that like and the first principles aren't so what to say out of this thing, right? Like read and write single source of truth. You should just have one place which says this is the most updated version. So what happens, right, is that the saving to database is also not instant because you can't overload the database as well, right? You can't keep saving to the writing to the database every time. The database write also happens a bit delayed. So you have this server, which is a Node.js server, which maintains the eventual consistency. So which means that if I am typing a keystroke, even before it goes to the database, it has to go to the other folks, right? It has to transmit, right? So that, which means there is no way that we can rely on any other source of truth but for the Node.js. So first thing, we cut off every place where it was being written using the, what to say, the API. That was first thing. Second thing, which we also realized is that the offline online state was very key, right? Like there were people who were writing when they were still offline, or not necessarily offline when they were not connected to the server, right? They might still be online, but they were not connected to the server. The browser didn't probably connect to the server. So we had to be absolutely sure that do you have an established connection to the server and it's live, right? That is the only point when the editor is enabled, else the editor is locked, right? So that is also another thing. And there are places where we couldn't probably overdo it also, right? Let's say, for example, if you have let's say if we look at the place where there is some amount of lag and we stop letting them edit it, every time when they stop editing it, they will be frustrated. The user experience is completely gone, right? So that's probably one of the things that we did. Just looking back at how else we debugged, right? I think one of the things, of course, the most obvious one was logging, right? Like we had the moment we saw this issue, we added we overdid the amount of logs that we had to do.
To the point of adding trace logs to
Yeah,
see
right.
how exactly the data is flowing through the system.
Yeah. And yeah, so I think that is one thing. Second is I think versioning was the other obvious thing, right? In the sense that we actually did versioning. I'm thinking what else did um, So with one of the customers, when we were working with this, when somebody was, so we did a lot of customer calls and try to understand their scenario. In what case did this happen, right? And I think one of the things which came out very constantly is that compared to earlier, the collaboration significantly increased. Earlier, it was the case that mostly one person was writing the document and other people were just viewing it, right?
Yeah.
Here, the use case was significantly that multiple people were writing it parallelly, right? Like 3, 4 people were writing it parallelly, right? So those customer conversations helped. And the other one which we started did is that we did multiple rounds of, like, we told, like of course our team is pretty small, so but we said that this time to this time everybody come on call on Zoom, come to this editor and start writing, right? So we did like a mass testing within our company itself to overload the system, right? That's also something that we did so that we can actually find out where things were going wrong.
So I assume you would have introduced the logging, then you would have done this like mass testing within your team to overload the system, and you would have studied the logs to understand where exactly the data is getting overwritten. Did that logging in the review of the logs help you discover that this web API getting called is one of the culprits?
Yeah, I think like, to be honest, this web API getting called was more from my previous experience, right? Like in the sense that we had done this sort of issue where I had like, I think all this connection, disconnection, web API was all primarily because of that. I had it done, and pretty much I try to like, I wasn't involved when this feature was being built. Like I didn't do the code review and I wasn't directly involved.
Yeah.
So when I went deep inside, that's when probably I could understand that the web API hitting was the primary issue, right? And even when we removed it, there were places where we had like, I think the offline online, these were also the issues which were there, but pretty much that was one of the key like, my previous experience was the one which actually helped, right? So there.
Got it. It's very interesting that, it's more often than not, it's the case that when an issue of this scale happens, right, the team won't be able to handle it because the issue is so complex that nobody is able to make sense of it. And more senior folks would get involved, and they don't have the first-hand experience in writing the code. That code was written by the team, they were not involved. That's usually the case. While the past experiences help, right, I want to like double click on a few things here. So first is that the logs were there and the team should have had some clue by looking at the logs that there is this web API which is apparently serving the wrong version, and that's coming back at a later point. If you just study like the write logs by the client IDs and which client sent the wrong payload, and tracing it back to, okay, if this client sent the wrong payload, then what did this client get in the first place? Where did they get the wrong payload from? And it's like just step by step debugging to discover it. Was the team able to uncover it just using the logs, or I assume not, because you got involved and there was a design review that happened as well, and through that white box review of the code, you guys realized that this is also a touch point where
actually there were two things which helped. One of the thing is that so of course the logs are a lot, right? Like, it's not easy to pinpoint which, like,
true that
logs is too much, right? What we were trying to do is that we were trying to like, version history along with the logs help. So version history, so it's like we are trying to narrow down to the exact precise time when that incident happened. To look at that precise incident, what we did is that like, the version history, right? You look at the version history, like, usually the version history is supposed to be increasing in your size, right? It has to keep increasing in size. Nobody actually deletes the whole thing by intention, right?
Yeah.
So what we did also is to find out what is the exact point when the volume of the revision history just came down, right? Like
by a very non-trivial amount. It just dropped through a huge amount, like more than, like, let's say 50% of the size dropped.
Exactly. Like, there are times where like 1995, which is like obviously that they have lost data, right? So we would just go and find that exact moment and try to go and look at the logs at that point, right? saying that, what exactly had happened there? Where did they fetch the most recent data from, right? And I think probably my weak memory, did we uncover that it was because of the web API at that point? Um, uh, or maybe we already realized it and it probably validated that, that's the source. But essentially it was just narrowing down to the fact that that was the most important problem.
Got it. How long did this debugging last? Was it a week, 2 weeks? How long was it?
It was at least so I think it was a week plus, and it was a nightmare in the sense that I had at least 3-4 people in the team completely lost sleep, right? Usually and it's more around the helplessness, right? It's more around the helplessness that, hey, what, I don't and you can't even revert back to the non-collaborative version, because people are expecting that collaborative editing is the default, right? Now if you go back to the non-collaborative experience, when people are collaborating, the expectation is that, hey, now you have to refresh the page to get the recent data, right? So
Yeah.
you can't even revert back, and the alternative is to say that shut down and go back to your original ways of the old ways of doing it, right? And the business also constantly coming and asking, hey, what, this is making a lot of lack of confidence, right? In terms of, people are extremely worried. And even, to be honest, there were times where we were close to doing renewals, and this is massive issue, right? In the sense that, hey, we are going to renew, but it seems like your system is highly unstable, right? Should we even go and write in it? Those sort of questions, when it starts coming, it was probably a week of sort of helplessness. And I'm also thinking probably I should have done the first round of what to say, bare bones code walkthrough to me, because I hadn't seen that code. If that had been done earlier, maybe we could have found a lot more issues upfront, right? We did a lot of other small things, like say reducing the debounce time. These are some small things that we did. Though, like we said that, hey, what, it's okay. The database is going to get overload, but we are not going to lose any data. So let's try to reduce the debounce, but that didn't help. Eventually, so I think if I clearly remember, right, the API that actually gave this actually uses, I think, some Postgres or some sort of, it directly writes and reads from the database, right? It didn't have like the documentation never said that you can read and write from API, right? And there were the places where you reload the data from the server. Like when you go offline and online, it needs to reload the data from the server. That was automatically handled by this library. And we didn't even know that there was an interface to do that, right? And to identify that interface itself took time. So we knew that it shouldn't be with API from the web, but where should it be from also was not something, and it was not really it was actually in beta. That specific collaborative editing library was in beta, right? So it was not publicly launched also. So we did take a risk to go with that library. And of course, it's not that the library was not good. It's mostly I think the documentation was not as precise as it would be.
Yeah, because they were in beta, the documentation wouldn't be cutting edge and at par with all the capabilities, documenting each and every nook and corner of that library.
Yeah.
Yeah, got it. So one more question. This is probably a tangential one, but how would the library actually store the in-flight pieces on the backend? Assuming that the Node.js server has multiple instances running, because you need to horizontally scale your web server, then you need consistent handling of one particular document's all the requests by a particular web server itself, assuming that's happening in memory. Or was there a central Redis or Memcache sort of a thing where it was doing it centrally and hence the server didn't matter?
It's a good point. I think as of right now, we just run on single Node.js server. So I'm assuming that it's running on.
Okay, I think that's simplified. So being at low scale, sort of simplified the situation.
Was also fairly small, but I do I think there should be some sort of what to say provision where they would have, let's say, Redis or some sort of immediate write and read sort of mechanism which is there. But we didn't use any of those. We just directly, like, I think we just pushed the eventual consistency to the server, while the what to say, ephemeral content was maintained by the Node.js server itself.
Right. Awesome. So let's focus on the panic part. You mentioned, and I can completely imagine how stressful it is when a core part of a product that you would have publicized, so enthusiastically, just stops working, and stops working to the point where it's not that it's not working, but it's working negatively. It has a net negative effect, not a net zero effect. And the business is on your head. The developers have no clue. Tech team is also stressed out because there are a lot of combinations and none of them are making sense, and you still don't have a way to explain what is happening. So there is a complete state of panic. From such a panic, how do you come out and still retain your strategic lens so that you're able to come up with more creative ideas about how to explain it technically, and then actually have the guts left to try it on the ground? If you are completely in panic, then it's very easy to just start running helter skelter here and there, and it just becomes a completely non-productive show. What are your experiences in this area, either from this situation or from other situations as well? Like, how have you seen yourself as well as your team handle this panic, and were there any good learnings that have stayed with you?
Yeah, I think probably so I've been in several times where there is like absolute panic, where like, I think downtimes are the natural panic, like in the sense that like, I think more when there's a downtime and you can actually find out, that's more like, I would say it's not a panic. Like, you have your playbook of checklist of things when
Yeah.
you go down. But when there is absolutely no checklist, or let's say, I think my first experience was that, like, I think this was when I was an engineer. We were actually building a library, like our product used to work with the Facebook API, right? And there was a effort that was done to abstract out Facebook API, and so that we can connect with any other APIs like Facebook API, Twitter API for the gaming part, right? Like, and have like a single API which can connect to different gaming channels. And we had to migrate our game to move to that specific thing. One of the things that happened is that and this usually has like this is a consumer product, and the scale is high. And like, at that point is where I think the logging part really stuck with me, right? Like, we used to use Splunk at that point. And Splunk was like phenomenal, like in the sense that, like, every time when I use the current Elasticsearch infra which we use today,
The ELK infra.
the ELK infra that we use today, I usually look back to that Splunk moment. So what we had is that when we launched this, it was actually a bloodbath, right? I think while the bloodbath was there, like, in a sense, bloodbath primarily, like, a lot of 500 errors hitting in the API.
You're talking about this collaborative document editing or some other instance?
When I was an engineer, this was like probably
Okay, got it.
10 years back. This was my first experience of what to say, complete panic mode. I think one of the things, like, mostly at that point, it was more around that because it's a consumer product. And like, pretty much at that point, we worked overnight to fix all the issues. Like, in a sense that at that point, when we launched it, it didn't go through all the steps of launch review that it should have, right? So when we launched it, one of the things that helped at that point was that my engineering leader sat next to me for the next 2 days, and and he was actually hands-on, right? Like, in the sense that at that point, usually, like, most of the time he wouldn't be hands-on. He would be like, what, like, if you're shipped, let's move forward. But these 2 days he was pretty much hands-on, trying to build up a strategy with me. And that sort of also stuck that these are the points where they definitely need some sort of support, like it, and you should just directly jump into the situation. In this one, what we did was also is that, like, try to isolate. Like, I think the first thing is that in this scenario, like, just rewinding back to the past, also the first question to even think about is there a way to go back to the original state, right? Can we revert it back? So that's a decision that we first try to take, right? At that point also, I think that it was at a place where we couldn't go back, right? Like the migrations were done, and people had moved their um, app to a newer version. So it is going, like, it would take another release to, and everyone had to refresh their app, and nobody would do that. So it was at a no return that at that point, and we decided not to go revert. And usually what we try to do is to revert, like that's the most natural thing to do, to revert, so that you can buy some time. These two, like the first situation which I mentioned when I was an engineer, and even in this situation, we couldn't really revert, right? Like the reverting is not even an option. So what we did, like in this specific scenario, is to figure out, can we find out who are the specific people who would be impacted by this thing, right? Let's go back to our product analytics and find out who are the people who are actually using it in a collaborative way, right? And go and talk to those customers. So make sure that your customer success managers are actually working with them, and provide and first strategy is to buy more time, right? Like you want to buy more time to fix it, because if you try to fix things in panic, things would even get worse, right? So at least like buy indefinite amount of time immediately, right? Like within yourself, if you can buy indefinite amount of time. What we did is that, like the customer success folks, we said that, what, now you have to be on, like you have to ask them when is their next review. And if you know that there is going to be a review happening a day before, we are going to be on always on support with them. Like it's actually a proactive support, right? In the sense that you would keep monitoring that if they're writing and if the data is going right. And it's not even a tech support, it's actually going to be a customer success support, where they are going to be very like the first thing that we would go and tell them is that, what, can you postpone your reviews by a week, so that we can go and fix it by then, right? We have that time. So we try to figure out what can buy us that time, right? That was one thing that stuck. And I think couple of other things usually is that with the junior engineers, like of course they are already in panic, right? Like then at that point, you as a person who is experienced, if you try to corner them and try to say that, and sort of get into a blame thing, saying that, what, like how can you do this, or just throwing out that anger out, right? Like how can you do this, or that was not something which I had that experience, and that sort of support helped, right? Like of course it was not that, like most of the time if the junior engineer is failing, it's not that the junior engineer is failing, it's the process that failed, right? We didn't do the proper code review, we didn't do the proper what to say, due diligence before it got shipped. So of course that poor chap is nothing got to blame, right? So just like, and then I usually, whenever these panic moments happen, I do have a one-on-one with the actual person as well, like, and tell them that, hey, this is happening, and usually just talk about my previous experience of when I had these sort of panic moments like several times, and how worse it was, like, like I think there were, and then talk about a couple of my friends who are also running startups. Like they had an intern who's just completely deleting a database, and they're today probably the engineering director of the same company, right? So those stories have actually tell them that this is major issue. It's not that it's like, it's not that we can let it go and be chill about it. We have to be all hands in, but don't sort of panic yourself by, like, I think usually what I try to ask, how are you doing, right? Like how are you, and they get into a lot of guilt mode. What, it was my mistake, I did it, like, and just try to say, normalize it a bit and say that, this is something that we have to make our process better. And that's usually one of the ways. And your temperament also shows to them, right? If you're angry and like if you're about to burst, then they are going to be also less risk averse with being creative in terms of ideas, right? So try slightly more open, and asking them inputs also will tell them what is it that, how should you react in these situations.
Help them process that, this is at some point in your career, this is going to happen. If you're doing high performance software where you're shipping very fast. Somewhere or the other, you'll make mistakes, and just help them process that goes a long way in reducing their stress levels, because they can like put it in perspective. They are not demonizing themselves once you do that counseling and once you do that small one-on-one conversation. Typically during the incident, when the firefighting is going on, is when such conversations help the most. So you shared a couple of techniques. One was the counseling and the conversation during the firefighting. Before that was to be able to stomach the fact that this has happened. As a senior engineer, you have to first digest it yourself so that you are grounded and you are stable. And that's a skill that's learned. I mean, very few people have it out of the box, but most people, I don't know anybody who has seen that kind of a stress in their life, in their personal life. And you need to learn it. So getting exposed to that stress and going through it and then processing it afterwards also helps you build that capacity to stomach the stress in the right way in your system, so that you are stable and then you can help your team. If you are panicking, then your team is doomed. So that is the second thing that you brought out. And before that, you talked about buying more time so that there is just more elbow room to try things and make mistakes. The mindset basically plays a big role. All three relate with the mindset in the solution where you are trying to buy time. You're trying to create a safe space where it is possible to experiment a little bit, and your team has that breathing room. The other two as well, they being able to stomach the gravity of the situation and then counseling the juniors. They go towards like creating that mental peace. So yeah, like completely agree. Have you seen I mean, what happened? So what happened with you specifically? Let's talk about that. There would have been a point where you didn't know these things. You didn't know that you have to stomach the situation. You didn't know that you have to counsel. And what happened when you didn't know versus then you learned it? And of course, now the things are much better, but can you contrast both the experiences if possible?
Sure. I think one of the things before we jump into this specific question in terms of the learning as well, right, is how can you stomach this, right? Like, and the real gravity of the situation comes in if you are able to associate a dollar value to this incident, right? If you actually say that, you know what, like, there is a chance that like the dollar value could be as simple as, you know what, current revenue going away. Like, of course, your current customer is disappointed and they're going to say that, hey, you know what, I'm not going to use your product, I'm not going to renew, bye-bye, right? And in an early stage startup, if this customer is a large customer, then the value is going to be like, it's not just revenue to you, right? It's also that they are going to be like a poster child for you for future sales, right? So one is that future sales and the current, and when you set the revenue number to it, it becomes like extremely depressing, right? It becomes like, oh my God, like so much of effort that has gone into, and you are at a phase where you probably finished the meeting with them a week back in a very happy tone, and you're assuming that, okay, things are all good.
Yeah.
And this happens, right? This happens. And what the first thing is to actually like, you know, like being as a founder, I think the first thing what I try to do is to have a conversation, like again with my co-founder, and try to understand what is the worst thing that could happen from here. Like, what is the like bare minimum that we can live with, right? We might be left with a very bad name in the industry that, you know, it's a unstable product, right? We might be left with the fact that they might go ahead and they might not be a reference to other customers, and we would lose X percentage of our annual recurring revenue completely, right? So just putting that upfront, saying that what is the worst thing, or it could be even worse, right? Like when things are like, this was actually negative in terms of productivity, but when it comes to even situations where like security issues could have legal implications as well, where they could actually sue you. Like, fortunately, we didn't have any of those, but in the sense that those could happen as well, right? So those are certain things. If we have it very clear, saying that this is what that could worse happen, then just looking at that and trying to process that, how can we bounce back from there? Like, do we have that energy to bounce back from there? Gives you that there's nothing worse that can happen from there. Let's try to work from, let's try to make the situation better from there, right? That helps. Though that like I think that might sound very cynical, but that probably puts the, what to say, the worst case situation in front of you. uh, that's a point. Just to add to the stomaching part, in terms of the how did I process this for the first time, mostly I think in terms of me, I do have a bunch of folks who I talk to understand, hey, you know what, this has happened, how do you do this when it has happened to you, right? And that sort of community actually helps me to normalize, right? Like, I think this example that I told in terms of the database also actually comes from one of my friends, right? Like, they say that, you know what, this happens, right? Like, this is how you mature, right? Like, and sometimes it's even like people say that, you know what, you're lucky that probably you got this early in your startup. Like, if these sort of issues happen much later, then the cost is going to be even more higher. So at least be grateful that the cost is much more lower right now, right? So those sort of things actually help me normalize, like, recently. But I think the first time when I was in sort of this panic situation, I think that, like, that support from the uh, senior engineering leader in a non-judgmental way, right? Like, in a non-judgmental way helped a lot, right? Like, not showing a face of disappointment, not showing a face of frustration on me, but actually frustration at the fact that probably the problem is not being solved is fine, okay? But that sort of helped me to maybe normalize that better.
Interesting. Yeah, like I don't think looking at the worst case scenario is cynical. It just makes it more clear, right? You know that this is the worst that can happen. So now there is visibility because you know that beyond this, it is not going to cause any harm. And it really helps our primal mind make sense of the situation where, when the mind is in the fight or flight mode, it basically feels that a tiger is attacking you and that I'm going to die. And seeing that worst case where, yeah, I'm going to have a revenue loss of X $1,000 ARR, or whatever the amount is. That's it. Like, I am not in danger. The revenue is in danger. And that definitely goes a long way in my personal experience in creating that psychological safety, because once your mind calms down is when you come back to your senses and you can again be strategic and do problem solving. But when you're in the panic mode, you can't do problem solving. So it's not at all cynical. It's in fact the most logical thing to see your worst case scenario. Yep. If you had an advice to give to young engineers, like what would that be?
When you say young, how young? Are they like freshers?
Young as in, yeah, good question. Let's put it in 5 to 7 year experienced range, where they have done a few years of work in the industry. They know how to do how to write good code, how to do code reviews, how to do low level design, how to do system design. All of that they know, but they haven't seen a lot of stressful situation, and they want to grow in their career, but there is a glass ceiling that is coming, and typically it is the lack of experience that people verbalize this as, that I know everything that I'm supposed to know, but I don't have the experience. I don't have the experience of handling intense, like high level, high stakes software. I don't have experience in working in a startup. I don't know if I'll be able to go and work in a startup. So there is a very interesting point in their journey where they actually take the leap of faith, and that leap is not very hard to take. What happens is when people have taken the leap, they get bitten by the situation. Maybe they don't have the right support system around them. Maybe they don't have the right mindset, and they get bitten by the stress. stress of handling that production issue sort of a situation which they are not able to solve for a long time. And that long is also a very relative adjective. The long, like 1 hour can be very long for some people. Maybe 3 days are also not very long for some other set of people. But let's say it's long enough for them to feel that burden and feel truly the burden, where they feel that a whole mountain is being put on their shoulders and they don't know how to remain calm. They don't know, like they just want to run away. And that changes people. Consider somebody at this juncture, how, like what advice would you give them? How would you tell them to, like what should they change to be able to, do better things? Because it's not the competency, assume like proper competency at a technical level. It's the stress that's taking them down.
I think what you're asking is a question that what sort of advice do I have for engineers who are like 5 to 7 who haven't taken this sort of situations, or if they had, what should they do?
Both. So maybe they have faced such, let's consider a person who has faced such situations and they haven't actually handled them well. I think they'll be able to appreciate the advice a lot more. If they've never seen situations like this, then yeah, like the advice is not going to make sense to them. But they've seen a few situations and they haven't handled them in a proper way, and they are spooked now. So what should they change? What should they do?
Yeah, I think the first thing probably is to like usually they talk about wartime CEO versus peacetime CEO, right? Like when things are all going good, you need to have a different way of reacting to things, right? You want to be more efficient, you want to be more highly productive, you want to make sure their sprints are running the best planned way and everything, right? But when it's a wartime, usually when things are on fire, when all the things that you planned out actually are failing, or let's say, for example, your website is absolutely down, but you don't even know where to go and fix it. Let's say, I think one of the examples is that like you have probably made a product live, but you don't even have a checklist of what all things that you need to go and do when your website is down, right? I think, and if it was not handled well, let's say your website was down for probably like more than a couple of hours, right? I think the first thing is, what I generally try to do is to not really try to beat yourself up, right? Like I think, like try to associate the incident as an event, right? And then when like in organization they write this incident report, right? In small startups, it's not a common thing to go and write this incident report, but actually the reflection around like how, like what has helped so far to me is that when such incidents happen, trying to go to like second by second understanding of what exactly has happened, right? Even to the precise information that if there were two engineers talking to each other, what were they talking, right? Like what was the Slack conversation? What are the messages that were sent? Where was the miscommunication? Like trying to get as much information just as possible, and just non-judgmental information to just understand that, like, where exactly that things went wrong, right? That usually has helped, right? In the sense that it just provides a lot more non-judgmental clarity that what exactly could have gone well, could have gone wrong, and more importantly, how like a lot of these fire drills happen, right? Like when your website goes down, what do you really do when it goes down again, right? Do you have like a playbook to go and handle that? And generally there could be playbooks for things which are just the most obvious ones, but walking that playbook for multiple other people in the team, like at this situation, one of the things that we try to do is to have more, like when such incidents happen, have more people to just observe what's happening, right? So that when they're just observing, they just see how people are trying to react. So there's always a Zoom call which is on during these situations where people can just jump in and see, what's happening, and they can understand and they can just drop off as well. Like it could as much as that they're just in a virtual room, right? Like of the situation room, right? those are things which has actually helped. But especially if I were in a situation where I hadn't handled that situation, I think the first thing is to take responsibility, and take responsibility in the sense that be um, just apologize without having any reasons associated with it, right? Just go and say that, hey, you know what, I messed it up, right? And usually this apology is one which I have seen, like usually we write apology to customers, right? And this apology can't be a, what to say, uh, standard apology. Hey, I'm sorry. That is like, it has to be something that you really mean, right? And if you
Yeah.
do, that apology itself sort of sets, like, especially at a situation where you don't have to answer to, like, if you have to answer to your customers, then you have to send the apology to your customers. Let's say you disappoint your manager, right? Like your manager was expecting something that you would have actually handled that situation well, and you messed it up. Having that honest, like maybe to a manager you don't have to send email or something, but just having that honest conversation with the manager, saying that, you know what, I disappointed and there is no one else to blame but for me, right? Like, and not really trying to victimize it, but just trying to take that responsibility, and also share clarity that, you know what, I spent time reflecting this entire incident, and these are the things which I thought that, went wrong, and these are the things that I should have done properly. So that being more self-aware and being honestly apologetic about it usually makes things slightly more better in a larger setup, right? In an organization, it helps. But of course, you, like, at the end of the day, how do, like, even offering the manager to be the, that, like, of course you have to answer to business. I'm happy to be in all those conversations where I can add more value, and of course, like, I don't mind, like, of course, being the manager. At the end of the day, they are also going to be responsible, but being the part that you're not just the only person getting the brunt, I'm happy to come to any of those meetings where you're going to be having conversations with others where they're going to be questioned. I can add more context and I can tell you where things went wrong. So those sort of things actually reduces the sort of blow that your manager is going to get.
Yeah, especially if you're a senior person. I mean, you can't expect a junior engineer to go to such meetings, but if you're a senior enough person, then going to such meetings and exposing yourself actually can be a good thing, because you can explain what happened firsthand, and you also get to see what happens on the other side of the table. From the business point of view, how are people looking at the situation? So, in a nutshell, you suggested three suggestions to a person who is struggling with this. First is that they should process what has happened. They should reflect on it. They should write an RCA. They should talk about it with their manager, and they should own up the responsibility. But they should understand what has happened and make sense of it. Second is they should prepare that a similar thing is going to happen again. So they have to write playbooks. They have to document a part of the learnings, and make it a bit more structured, so that next time it's not as unstructured and hence not as big a fire when that happens. And third, and a very interesting input that I felt, was to participate in SOSs where you are not directly involved. If you are going through an SOS, pull in other senior engineers who are not directly involved for them to witness it. If somebody else is going through an SOS and you are not involved, go and join and be part of that call. Because you are not part of the firefighting, you can understand it from a distance, like you're 2 steps away. So you get to see the whole chaos from a more peaceful perspective, and that usually gives you a little bit more wisdom.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think just observing what has, like, how a specific situation, like maybe when you're in that situation, you might just loop in that person again saying that, hey, I am facing a similar situation that you faced, can you help me out, right? There's that visibility of that sort of similar situation has been faced within the same organization is helpful. The other thing, just to also add in terms of what I also see, is that there is, like, when there are multiple hierarchical levels, right? That mutual empathy is very important, right? Let's say, for example, um, you are a engineering manager and there is like a director of engineering,
Yeah.
and you mess something up, right? Like, and of course that's something that you are supposed to own, and you messed it up. The director of engineering is going to have a meeting with probably like the customer facing person who is going to talk to the customer, right? Just understanding why is that customer success person so like, why are they so worried about it, right? Because the customer is going to blast at them, right? And understanding a lot more details helps this person as a engineer to understand the gravity, like the senior engineer, the gravity of the situation. And similarly, when they are part of that meeting and they saying that what exactly happened and absolutely owning up to that responsibility also gives that customer facing person to understand that, hey, you know what, there is no ill intention. There's actually a process failure or say some sort of miss. It was a human error that happened. Is also something that mutual empathy reduces the temperature overall. Else, what would happen is that the customer facing person would escalate to their leaders, and then the engineering escalates, and then it becomes the issue becomes like a massive blow up, right?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. The transparency is super helpful because more often than not, people are willing to accept that there is a failure as long as they understand that the failure is well understood by the respective folks and there are going to be process improvements and changes in the checks and balances so that this has a lower probability than today of happening. And as long as there is some improvement that you are able to show, people are more than willing to actually support you. But when like it just blows up when people don't take ownership and they deny responsibilities, when it just becomes very ugly and it just becomes a blame game, which is never productive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a very clear difference between entry level or junior engineer level. Like never should a junior engineer take responsibility, right? Because like in this case, like when things are failing, right? A junior engineer can't be made responsible like that. Like
it's a process failure. It's a collective failure.
It's a process failure, right? Like, and like the right people who should take responsibility should be the senior folks. And like, and if you are at a mid level, then I think you should step up and take that responsibility as well, right? Like, and
the juniors are not even I mean, they don't have the full picture, nor do they have enough competency to like understand what are the options available at their disposal. Whereas if you are mid-level or senior, then at least at mid-level you can appreciate that these are the things happening, and you can appreciate the non-technical side of it.
Exactly. And customer, the user impact part of it, I think the junior engineer may not really be able to synthesize as well, like how serious of this issue it is. They might not be able to synthesize it.
Sounds good. This was one hell of a conversation, Alagu. Loved the depth, loved the examples.
Yeah, like
thank you for chatting.
And I think happy that this sort of real experiences probably helps that like everybody is going to have these sort of issues in their career. It's not that it's like unless you're entering a company which has all processes set, right? There are all fences around to not make mess. Of course, it won't be. But when you're entering a company which is like early stage, not all fences are there, not all processes are there. So and like I would actually say that if you're experiencing this early in your career, it's actually a gift, right? So it's actually a gift that you will be much prepared to see it, how to handle it later in your career.
Right? You might not like it just in time. You'll feel very, very bitter about it. But it's one of the very crucial, very, very precious set of experience that makes you grow unbelievably.
Absolutely.
Later in your career. Yep.
Cool. Amazing conversation. Thanks for asking really insightful questions as well.
My pleasure. Let's do this again. Would love to hear more stories. I'm sure you have a lot more to offer. If you've listened till here, I hope you'll learn something new from experiences of Alagu. Do check out today's sponsor 10xEng. They are building a product to make your alert management streamlined. If you have any feedback, please comment or email us at hello@pakkanimbu.com. Thumbs if you liked it, subs if you loved it. See you guys next time.